Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I thought I would do something a little different. I'm going to be looking at this article called Why Politics and Religion Make Everyone Crazy and What You Can Do About It. It was put out by highexistence.com back in February 2020. Let's get into it. We have a large amount of stuff to unpack. Politics is a notoriously inflammatory topic of conversation. It is often impossible to have a calm and rational discussion of political issues. Why is this? In short, the majority of people base their politics on a tribal identity. Yes, we've been seeing more and more of this since 2016, if not even beforehand, back in the early 2020s. However, back then it wasn't as prevalent and visible. They choose a political tribe, red team, blue team, whatever, and their membership in this tribe becomes an important part of their identity. They then have little choice but to blindly support every position or policy idea their tribe supports, lest they be excommunicated from a tribe that is essential to their identity. We have seen this happen in real life, where people have changed their minds on certain things and have been excommunicated. Look at what happened with Lacey Green, who is a high-profile leftist YouTuber, when she and Sargon of Akkad actually talked and embraced at one point at VidCon in 2017. Her own tribe were quick to condemn and turn upon her. Tribalism, or way of thinking or behaving in which people are excessively loyal to their own tribe or social group, is extremely prevalent in human social organization. Yes, from a developmental point of view, tribalism probably is what allowed our ancestors to survive being hunted in the jungles of Africa, back when we were just crawling out of the primordial ooze. It's easier to scare off a lion or a hyena in a group rather than as a solo individual. Plus, groups hunting have more success at getting food than the individual. That is a given. Good water. In moderation, tribalism is normal. However, in excess, it can be catastrophic. Tribalism a good thing until it is not. As humans, we have a deep need to be part of some kind of tribe or community. The evolutionary psychology related reasons for this are decidedly straightforward. We evolved in relatively tight-knit tribes. Like I said beforehand, our ancestors probably used tight-knit groups to survive. And we were utterly dependent on them for our survival. For most of human history, supporting and defending one's tribe was quite literally a matter of death. Nowadays, however, we don't need tribes for our survival, but we do need them for our psychological well-being. I can see that. Rationalist blogger Scott Alexander identified a few obvious benefits of membership in tribes. Tribalism intensifies all positive and pro-social feelings within the tribe. It increases trust within the tribe and allows otherwise impossible forms of cooperation. Gives people a support network they can rely on when their luck is bad and they need help. It lets you be yourself without worrying that this will be incomprehensible or offensive to somebody who thinks totally differently from you. It creates a densely connected social network of people who mostly get along with one another. Makes people feel like they're part of something larger than themselves, which makes them happy. and can improve their physical and mental health. Those are some of the positive aspects of being in a tribal group or collective. However, there is a dark side, which is right here mentioned in this article. The dangers of tribalism are obvious. For example, fascism, based around dialing a country's tribalism up to 11, and it ends poorly. If I had written this essay 5 years ago, it would be titled Why Tribalism is Stupid and Needs to be Destroyed. When tribalism gets out of hand, things can get really ugly really fast. Tribalism arguably underlies many of the most atrocious wars, genocides, mass murders, and violent conflicts in human history. Harvard professor David Ropak elaborates on this. Tribalism is pervasive, and it controls a lot of our behavior, readily overriding reason. Think of the human beings we do in the name of... I'm going to reread this where I screwed it up. Screwing up proves I'm human. Think of the inhuman things we do in the name of tribal unity. Wars are essentially, and quite often, specifically tribalism. Genocides are tribalism. Wipe out the other group to keep our group safe. Taken to madness. Racism lets us feel that our tribe is better than theirs. Parents who end contact with their own children when they dare marry someone of a different faith, color, denial of evolution or climate change or other basic scientific truths when they challenge tribal beliefs. What a stunning evidence of the power of tribalism. We're also seeing the same thing on the left, too. The power of tribalism, where people who have different ideas or opinions get attacked, whether being derped or threats of physical violence. When people become supernormally invested in a particular tribe, they become capable of committing all sorts of hideous acts in the name of the tribe which they otherwise would not have committed. I remember being told this by somebody years ago when she was introducing me to philosophy. Weak people in a crowd or a large group of alike individuals can become murderers easily. They cling so tightly to the beliefs of their tribe that they become willing to kill those who have alternate beliefs. An exceptionally high degree of tribalism is what makes ISIS possible. Existentially distorted individuals are attracted to the tribe because it seems to offer them an essential truth or absolute truth, an answer for everything. Folks, I'm going to be honest. There is no absolute truth. Every person has their own version of the truth based upon their own experiences. And any person who claims to have the book of all knowing is either a fool or a liar. This is why tribalism is dangerous, and of course, the degree of tribalism of most tribes is not on par with that of ISIS. One could easily argue that Trump supporters, along with Antifa, are on the same level as ISIS, as well as resurgent neo-Nazi and far-right groups, as well as several leftist groups, are on the same level as ISIS. One must remain vigilant. Few people foresaw the rise of Nazi Germany, but all it took to turn most of the German population into tribalistic deathbringers was a hyper-charismatic leader, promising that he had absolute truth. And that brings me to another point I remember somebody made to me. Human beings, as a rule, always look for strong leaders, especially in times of crisis, and it doesn't matter who the leader is. Most of them are quite terrible. Don't believe me? Read history. read about the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte during the waning days of the First French Republic, as well as Felix Sala and the rise of Julius Caesar, both during the decline of the Roman Republic. All these men had one thing in common: ambition and ruthlessness to carry out that ambition. Which brings me to another article I found too when I was doing some research for a new program I want to do called Tyrants. Where people want a dictator. Rich autocracies use good governance to suppress yearnings for freedom. That's a challenge to democracies everywhere. He's dead, yet he's still everywhere, with many mosques, schools, and even sports complexes that bear his name. It's impossible in Oman to escape Sultan Qaboos bin Said, who died in 2020 after ruling for 50 years. Like other Gulf states, including the World Cup host Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, Oman seems to have cracked the code for becoming a successful autocracy. Even as their approaches to political freedom and their stances on issues like LGBTQ and women's rights fall short of what we in the West consider basic decency. Yet all it takes is to visit one of these countries, or one like Singapore, and speak with locals to better understand why they believe autocracy and not democracy is better equipped for the 21st century. Indeed, these autocracies are set to endure because their systems work well enough for most Omanis, Qataris, Emiratis, and Singaporeans, not because the government harshly represses its people as in Iran or Russia. They credit the government for making their countries the peaceful and rich ones they are today. They don't want regime change and they don't wish for democracy. They want a dictator, as long as the dictator continues to serve them well. And that's the thing with humans in general. People love having strong authority figures as long as their interests and basic needs are being met by the strong authority figure. It could be a religious authority or a dictator. The one thing I noticed when I read books about Nazi Germany is that Hitler was smart enough to know that he had to win over the German people. How did he do this? He rebuilt the German economy, which in itself was completely wrecked from World War I. He built new roads, built new buildings, large public works projects. He literally took an unemployment rate of 30% and reduced it down to 5% within 5 years of his coming to power, which won over large segments of the German population, combined with some slick propaganda made by Joseph Goebbels. That being said, that's another reason why politics and religion are terrible, is you get into the cult of the personality. What the cult of the personality is blind worship of a leader, basically, by the masses. North Korea is a prime example of this, and how people worship the Kim dynasty and its leaders. Their leader becomes everything. Hitler did the same thing in Germany. A large amount of the buildings and stuff bore his name. And from what I was reading, there are still certain places and spots where you can still see the old Nazi emblems or the outlines of them, though not as prevalent. But that's another video that I plan on making. Now to get back to this article. Sure, they had oil, but natural resources are hardly a recipe for national success when dealing with state weakness, ethnic divides, and poverty. The chaos that has plagued Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo for decades could very well have claimed Oman. as well, to say nothing of neighboring Yemen. But Quabos was headstrong and dedicated to developing his country. His first move was to squash a Soviet-backed separatist movement by building roads and schools. That's something you will find that most dictators do. To win over the masses is massive public building projects. He continued to peacefully subdue the rest of his people with public goods. Over the following 50 years, Quabos wielded the country's oil resources, which were only a fraction of those of the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, to give more and more Omanis. Roads were built and extensive. Airports are clean and well conceived. The government has long provided free education and substantial social security. People take real pride in having good, caring, and rich government that they believe is truly looking out for them. That's something else that you have to watch out for, is leaders who will act like kind benefactors. The kinder the leader, the more you have to doubt his intentions based on my own readings. Hell, Julius Caesar, on his way to being crowned dictator of Rome, threw out large quantities of gold on the masses, and numerous of his successor emperors did the same thing, bestowing large gifts of money onto the masses. Hell, when the Emperor Caligula took over Rome in 36 AD, he had literally 40 days of games as well as feasts which were free for the public. He also bestowed large amounts of gold on the masses to win the love of the people. But anywho, still Oman was not immune from the 2011 Arab Spring, which saw anti-regime protests across the Middle East and North Africa. But unlike protesters in those regions who demanded the ouster of their autocrats, most of Oman's demonstrations focused on a specific problem they wanted the ruling government to solve: lack of jobs. Whereas protesters abroad called for their authoritarian leaders not to govern at all, Omanis simply called on Quabos to govern better. He responded by expanding government spending and promising to create jobs. These moves mostly quelled the discontent, and the Omani miracle continued to chug along. Yet there were some lingering pressures facing Quabos' successor, Haytham. Oman's economy is really stagnated due to declining oil prices and COVID-19. How the country will replace oil as the world shifts to green energy remains unclear. People are increasingly calling for economic reforms. The country remains reliant on migrant labor from South Asia, creating a quasi-underclass that invites foreign criticism, even as the government works to bring more Omanis into the workforce. But yeah, that's why people love a dictator. That prime example. I'm going to read another example from Singapore. Other young men who took the reins of their impoverished lands as the colonial era ended won such social trust. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore was one of them. When Lee took over Singapore in 1959, much of the population was unskilled and illiterate. He too had to deal with difficulties inherent to diversity. Singapore's population comprised of Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, even a few Jews. Lee prioritized development over democracy, believing that Singaporeans wanted food, cash in their pockets, and strong hospitals more than they wanted liberty. Because Singapore had no natural resources to harness, Lee and his aides directed the government to focus on laying the groundwork for economic growth, which turned the city-state into a major financial hub. In Singapore's first 9 years of full independence, the gross national product nearly tripled, raising the average per capita income to the second highest in Asia. By the mid-1980s, many Singaporeans enjoyed a lifestyle rivaling the West's. Singapore was and remains what Lee called a first world oasis in a third world region. Clean, safe, and well-governed country. Lee was an autocrat, and Singapore remains an authoritarian country today. The government has long restricted a host of liberties, severely constraining any potential political competition. Dictators do not like competition. They want to rule, period. Free speech, as well as the right of assembly, as well as other basic forms, too, are essential human rights. Which, sadly, there's a growing number of people who want to get rid of those things, just so they can have the illusion of security and stability. For those are illusions. You may have picked up on the pattern here. Dangerous, deadly degrees of tribalism frequently arise in groups that are based around some sort of absolute truth, some fundamental ideology. People tend to be very attracted to the idea of absolute truth because if they find one, it can answer all of their questions and give them the sense that their lives have some sort of grand meaning. It's easy to see then why people and tribes based on supposed absolute truth on an ideology often become extremely hostile when their ideas are challenged. This isn't because it merely that their ideas are being called into question. It's that their tribal ideology, their absolute truth, the fundamental structure that makes their lives seem meaningful, the basis of their sense of security, stability, and certainty. American philosopher Terence McKenna recognized this connection between ideology, hostility, and violence, and was a particularly vocal critic of all forms of dogma and ideology. Ideology always paves the way toward atrocity. He elaborated also on the absurdity of believing one has found an absolute truth, and I will read that part of the article to you. Ideology kills. It is not a childish game. Ideology kills. I was very amused, The Heaven's Gate mass suicide was a tragedy, but there were these curious aspects to it. It was a week before Easter. All around me, I heard people saying things like, how could they believe such crazy stuff? And by the way, honey, did you get the dress for the service so we can go and celebrate the resurrection of the Redeemer? You just wonder whose ox is getting gored here. Because something is absolutely nuts, but 400 million people believe it. That makes it okay. But if 20 people believe something, that's a cult? I have an absolute horror of belief systems and cults. Belief is hideous. It's also completely unnecessary. Imagine a monkey walking around the idea that he or she possesses certain truth. You have to lack a sense of humor not to see the absurdity of it. We understand what we can understand. We build models. To do this without realizing the tentative nature of the enterprise is just damn foolishness. I can tell you a story about somebody I knew who thought she had the voice of God going through her. I reported her for making an inflammatory post on social media trying to get people to have fistfights on the Halifax transit buses with Trump supporters during the Summer of Love in 2020. I tried to reason with her, but all I got was a very hostile, you're part of the problem from her. I ended up contacting her employer and sending them the receipts, which were screenshots of her post. She was terminated from her job. That is how bad dogma and belief can cloud people's judgment. The rational part of their brain just goes out the window, so to say. Yes, I admire and respect his strength of convictions, but she took it too far. way too far over the line. That's the trick. You got to do things in moderation. You gotta always look for the truth and not trust everything you hear. Because history has proven that fact time and time again, if you read it. Now I'm going to finish the rest of what Mr. McKenna had to say here. That's why I say the thing to keep coming back to is felt presence of immediate experience. Not how do I feel as a feminist or a Marxist or a devotee of Hieronymus Bosch. How do I feel, period. Not through the filter of ideology as I look back through history. Very few ideologies last very long without going sour or becoming toxic. So why should we assume that all these naive societies in the past assumed that we have 95% of truth, and the other 5% be delivered by our best people in the next 3 years? Fools have always believed that. And that's just it, folks. Like this article says, ideologies are fragile because they can't deliver on all the answers. Nobody can deliver on all the answers. We have to find the answer that best suits us through our own experience and our own lens, so to say. I'm going to close out this video with a reading of Cicero, an essay that he wrote thousands of years ago called The Fallen State. The fallen state. The Roman state is founded on firm and ancient customs and its men. Ennius, Annals. The poet who wrote these words so brief and true seems to me to have heard them from a divine oracle, for neither men by themselves without a state based on strong customs or traditions, without men to defend them, could have established and maintained a republic such as ours, whose power stretches so far and wide. Before time, the cherished customs of our forefathers produced exceptional and admirable men who preserved the ways and institutions of our ancestors. But now, our republic looks like a beautiful painting faded with age. Our generation has not only failed to restore the colors of this masterpiece, but we have not even bothered to preserve its general form and outline. What now remains of the ancient ways of our country, the poet declares we were founded upon. These traditions have sunk so far into oblivion that we neither practice them nor even remember what they were. And what shall I say about the men? For the reason our customs have passed away is that the people who once upheld them no longer exist. We should be put on trial as if for a capital crime to explain why this disaster has happened. But there is no defense we can give. Our country survives only in words, not as anything of substance. We have lost it all. We have only ourselves to blame. Which is true. We have only ourselves to blame for allowing tribalism to hijack our religions as well as politics. Tribalism and religion have become intertwined into politics that it's hard to distinguish one from the other now. And that politics in itself is becoming a new pseudo-religion. For I fear that we will become, like Cicero said in his observation of the fall of the Roman Republic, just like that, a failed state. Good night.